social media activism. This is kind of relating to us. Like, how do we make sure that these issues, like that, what happened in Afghanistan and what happened, and what happens everywhere, kind of get noticed? And I think there's goods and bads about social media activism. I think if you look at social media activism in terms of like Instagram activism, which more specifically, more recently, actually, as of 2020 with the whole George Floyd thing, is where I think Instagram activism really started to take kind of a, light of its own, particularly with technology these days. Seems like everybody can make infographics. Everybody can make a post about a statistic that stands out to them and make it look all pretty. And suddenly it has 400,000 shares and everybody's looking at it. Right. So I feel like that's Instagram activism at its finest. And I feel like people think it's bad. I think it is. I think it has bad points to it. But I think there's also good points. And I wanted to kind of highlight how social media activism started, because this was something I was thinking about with this whole thing with Afghanistan. Yeah, there were a lot of infographics being shared on my feed about, the various, like, basically updating, trying to kind of consolidate this 200 plus year conflict into a mere 5 slides. I thought that this would, I was thinking about where social media activism came from. And I was doing a lot of research, and I happened upon the Egyptian Revolution back in 2011. So for those of you that don't know, the Egyptian Revolution happened way back 10 years ago now, 2011, January and February of 2011. And essentially what it was a bunch of young people gathering in the street in various Egyptian cities to protest their president, quote unquote president, but he was more of a authoritarian figure. He'd been in power for about 30 plus years at that point, and he basically abused his power to the point where he'd taken over. He basically had presidential privileges for 30 years at that point, and he'd rigged elections and done many other things, amongst also sending out his police. He had a secret police, and there was a lot of police brutality going on. There was a lot of issues. There's a lot, and you could discuss, the context of the Egyptian Revolution at length. I could do a whole show on that. But essentially, the Egyptian Revolution happens, and what is the catalyst for the Egyptian Revolution is social media. Because if you think about it, 2011 really isn't all that long ago, but it was kind of the beginning of this social media era that we live in now. You look at Facebook, you look at Twitter, you look at Instagram. I mean, all of these things were just forming. They were little babies when this revolution took place. But I mean, how this revolution really spread in message was due to a couple things. I think the first thing was due to a lot of young people using Facebook as a means to starting a conversation about Mubarak, who was the president of Egypt, and how, what he was doing was not right, and putting themselves in the front lines, organizing protests, using social media as more of a forum of discussion and to bring people together to kind of start this movement of social progress and get the revolution started. So social media activism actually started as a means to overthrow authoritarian leaders, which is kind of crazy. And eventually it ended up working for the Egyptian people. It was a lot of young people, and I'm going to get to that later. I think this is very important, and I'm going to emphasize this throughout this episode of Afghanistan. It's the young people. The young people are the answer. Yeah, and I mean that. I mean, I know I love to crap on our generation and say we use social media too much, and we get depressed over little things, but it's the young people. Every single world conflict, the end to the conflict, or maybe a pause in the world conflict, is due to young presence. I'm a firm believer that young blood is one of the cures, in a sense, to old problems, because they approach things with a different perspective, a fresh perspective, and they're able to use that to eventually become, or eventually, put their ideas in place. And I feel like it happens every generation. Every generation is fighting the problems of the past generation. And it's no different in this case. 10 years ago, these millennials, they were millennials in Egypt, were fighting this tyrannical ruling of Mubarak. And eventually, after 14 days of nonviolent protests, for the most part, of coming together, of putting religion aside, which is the key point. They put religion aside in Egypt, which is a majority Muslim country. And they said, no, this isn't about religion. We're not going to make this about religious division. We're going to make this revolution about social progress and moving the needle forward when it comes to social issues, when it comes to the way women are treated, et cetera, et cetera. And who was at the front line of this? It was young men and young women who fought for the rights, or who fought in the streets non-violently and protested against the government. And eventually they got what they wanted, which is pretty crazy that this happened a mere 10 years ago. Of course, there was a big other revolution, not revolution, but a big other, riots and a bunch of other stuff that happened to oust Mohamed Morsi, who is the president that was elected later, because he ended up taking his power to he ended up taking too much power and all of that stuff. And that led to a whole separate scenario. But the first Egyptian revolution was because of young people. And the second thing I wanted to bring up in terms of the good is that there was this guy in the Egyptian revolution by the name of Bassem Youssef, who is crazy. He's basically the Egyptian he was the Egyptian Jon Stewart, and he sort of started his show from his basement. And he was basically just criticizing how the incompetence of the government, so to speak. And eventually that led like Egyptian billionaires to notice, like, holy crap, there's an opportunity on our hands. And basically they gave him the reins to his own show, and he eventually got his own like talk show / daily show type political satire show in the Middle East, where suddenly, political satire became a thing. Criticizing the government became a thing in an awfully authoritarian regime, right? And it's crazy that none of this would have been possible without social media. Bassem Youssef would never have become a thing. And I would encourage all of you guys to look him up. He has a crazy story, and there is much more that went into all of that. I basically oversimplified how he got to where he got to. But Bassem Youssef, without social media, without YouTube, without being able to spread that message, without being able to have a free forum to kind of talk about the issues that are going on, would not have been, there wouldn't have been a revolution. There wouldn't have been people kind of bringing this to life, which is crazy. And so that was just something I was thinking about. And that's where social media activism comes from. It comes from a really good place. But let's talk about the bad, because I think this is important as well. And I think the bad of social media activism is this whole idea that we see now of like infographics getting shoved down your throat to the point where every single little issue is becoming a big issue that you can turn into, because you can just use Canva, use the Microsoft Paint, and build an infographic and make it look nice. That's the fact. You can make any false statement and put it in an infographic and make it look pretty, and suddenly people will believe it, right? Like that's not right. We should not be in that situation where you can make any claim and make it look nice, and all of a sudden on Instagram, you post it on Instagram, it gets a few thousand shares, and suddenly people are talking about it. Like, I feel like that is kind of straying away from the whole point of what social media activism started out to be, which was this forum of conversation and of creating a place where we can where we can keep the government accountable, or we can organize events to keep the government accountable, or start conversations in the World Wide Web that get people all over the world talking, that can, alert other people in power to make the changes that are necessary. That's where social media activism comes from. And now I see this social media activism stuff with Afghanistan, and it feels so haphazard, guys. It feels so fucking haphazard when you just share an infographic on the internet and say, oh, Afghanistan, and it disappears off your story 24 hours later and you move on with your life, right? Like, that infographic, like, what do you think it did? What do you think in the grand scheme of things you sharing that infographic did? I share infographics sometimes. I'll give it to you, right? But that infographic, it probably isn't doing much. Most people aren't even clicking on it. And the few that do just scroll past. It's not a big deal. In the grand scheme of things, we need social media activism now has become so oversaturated to the point where you sharing an infographic does nothing for anybody. And that's just the truth. That's the truth of the matter, is that it does nothing for anyone. And in that case of just sharing posts, it's an empty action is how I'd consider it, because there's no real like thought behind it. It's just, oh, share, click, like. Okay, I'm doing this for my own image rather than the actual cause. So that's why I encourage people to actually genuinely read and go on the internet and read articles and, read about the historical context of things, watch documentaries, do all of these things, because that is what's going to educate you about issues, not these fucking infographics that you see emptily shared on Instagram. That doesn't mean shit. Woke Instagram is bullshit. Like, I'm here to say it. Woke Instagram is stupid. And if you believe that social media activism is good, I'm curious to hear why. Because in my opinion, I think it's dumb. And I think it's really freaking stupid that people think that by sharing a post, they're somehow helping someone in Afghanistan. Like, really? Are you? Like, I encourage people to think about that for a second. But that's what I'll say about the bad when it comes to social media activism. I think social media activism started in a good place, but now we're in a bad place. And maybe there's a medium ground, maybe there isn't. Maybe we'll just kind of trend further and further into Canva infographics, or, we'll see what happens. We will see what happens with that.